started. Thank you all so much for joining us. Welcome. What a lovely smattering of new faces amongst the familiar. I'm the curator of the Herman Teapot National Inland Waterways Library, and it's my great privilege to welcome you to the 2023 Donald T. Wright and James V. Swift Awards. I'm sure you've noticed when you came in that the library is in a bit of a transitionary period. We're preparing for a major renovation that will include a brand new state-of-the-art art gallery, a sweeping grand staircase at our entrance, and more. For our new guests, I just wanted you to know we don't always look like that up there, so be sure to come visit us again in the spring of 2025 to see it all finished. Every other year, the library presents the Donald T. Wright and James V. Swift Medal to honor individuals who have made significant contributions to maritime journalism and literature. The Donald T. Wright Award was first established in 1965 at the Southern Illinois University by the Waterways Journal and transferred stewardship to the St. Louis Mercantile Library in 1988. Until that time, there was no formal recognition to encourage excellence in maritime journalism and literature. The award is named after a man who in many ways did more for river literature than any other person of the 20th century. He was the editor of the Waterways Journal for nearly 45 years, as well as a riverman himself and a fierce advocate for the development of our nation's waterway system. From the hundreds of articles he wrote, to the papers he delivered, to the books he collected and reviewed, Donald Wright was as integral to the development of river literature and journalism as he was the development of rivers themselves. Under his guidance, the Waterways Journal grew from a struggling trade magazine to become the industry paper for rivermen across the country, a designation it still holds today. Since its creation, the Wright Award has been presented to many distinguished individuals. Last year's recipient was the Honorable Thomas C. Grady, who's among us today, for his publication, The Lost St. Louis Riverfront. His groundbreaking book, if you'll forgive the pun, because I know how Tom loves them. His groundbreaking book was the first study to document the full history of the area that is now the Gateway Arch National Park, specifically the individuals and businesses that occupied the buildings destroyed to make the way for the park, and the impact that this loss had on the city's riverfront and sense of identity. Other recipients have included the New Orleans Times-Picayune photography staff for their fearless reporting of Hurricane Katrina, legendary folk musician, author, and riverboat pilot John Hartford, newspaper journalist and editorial cartoonist Dan Martin, who's also with us, Herman Teapot, chairman of the board of Pot Industries, celebrated author Ben Lucien Berman, Richard Bissell, author of My Life on the River, Experiences as a Riverboat Captain, and Dr. Carl E. Kramer, author of Rivers of Time, A History of American Commercial Lines, among many other incredibly talented and passionate award recipients. The James V. Swift Medal was first established in 2006 by the Pot Library at the Mercantile. Like the Wright Award, it's named after an individual who helped define 20th century river literature and journalism. James Verdon Swift joined the Waterways Journal at the end of World War II in the business department. He brought with him a lifelong fascination with the river and river history, and it wasn't long after joining the team that he began writing the wildly popular Old Boat column, which he continued to do for the remainder of his 60-plus year at the Journal. And I know it's still one of the most popular columns in the Journal today. For the last 17 years, the Swift Medal has recognized individuals who made outstanding contributions to maritime literature. The last award was presented to David Lobig for his text panels and wall labels in the Missouri Historical Society's popular exhibition, Mighty Mississippi. Using a mix of historic objects, photographs, and media, Mr. Lobig took the grandeur of North America's greatest river and placed it in the context of the cultures that have grown and thrived around it. Other past recipients have included Dan and Connie Burkhart, who authored Growing Up with the River, 9 Generations on the Missouri, Anne Bloom for her publication, The Steamer Admiral, Instruct the Steamers, Captain Charles E. Lehman for his lifetime of work aboard boats in capacities ranging from deckhand to master pilot, as well as his publication, A Riverman's Lexicon, and Gregory Thorpe for his outstanding photography capturing the life, workers, and industry of America's inland waterways, including his publication, Rivers Run Past. Tonight's award recipients make worthy additions to this list of remarkable rivermen and women, authors, artists, journalists, and scholars. On the surface, the works they are being honored for may seem miles apart in subject matter, but truly at their core, they have much in common. Both authors painstakingly sought to document and preserve stories of individuals and communities whose lives were indelibly intertwined with the rivers they lived, worked, and dreamed upon. Individuals often overlooked, misunderstood, and misrepresented by the popular historical narrative. Both award recipients shed new light on these communities, casting aside stereotypes and opening the door to future avenues of research. It is a privilege and an honor to have them both here with us this evening. So without further ado, I'd like to invite the Pott Library's Board President, Nelson Spencer, to present the 2023 Donald T. Wright Award.
Thank you, Sarah. Is this the mic?
No.
Before I get started, I'd like to recognize one of the pilots who's featured in our award winner's book. He made a special trip to be here today, Jerry Tinky. Jerry started as a deckhand. I mean, about as green a deckhand as you can be on the river, and rose to be the president of the inland marine portion of the biggest coal company in the nation. He's done an outstanding job also for the industry in his service to the American waterways operators. Thank you, Jerry, for being here.
Thank you.
Well, if only we had taped all those river stories our granddaddy told us. You've heard that many times. And it just repeats itself over and over again. But for some reason, stories about the river just bear telling, and most go unrecorded. But now someone has taken the time and effort to set them down in writing and preserve them for the future. The book, Life Between the Levees, America's Riverboat Pilot, is the culmination of no less than 10 years spent interviewing over 100 towboat pilots by this year's award winner. An internationally recognized photojournalist. She's from a river family and married to Steve Golding, chairman and owner of multi-generational Golding Barge Line, who couldn't be here today, but is represented by his son, Austin. Equipped with an assortment of cameras, notebooks, and a tape recorder, our award winner traveled to river towns and often rode the boats to talk to the men and women whose recollections she solved. Life Between the Levees begins with a narrative of a riverman who was born in 1915 and worked on a stern wheel steamboat Reliance. It ends 300 pages later with the words of a pilot born in 1987 who runs excursion vessels with all the modern conveniences. Not only do the stories provide the reader with a sense of the progress that's taken place in towboat life over the years, but they paint an entertaining picture of the people who make their living on the river. One storyteller recounts a foggy night on the Chapelai River when the crew of a towboat tried to tie the boat off on a stump, only to find out when they threw the line that it was a bear curled up on the bank. And what a stir it caused. Other similar experiences add to the richness of the book, interspersed throughout our award winners' colorful photographs. Please know, she writes in the foreword, reflections within this book are a very rare look into the personal lives of those who have dedicated themselves to the river. It is authentic, honest, sometimes funny, outrageous, often sad, and even tragic, as is true with all real-life stories, no matter the profession. It is a slice of genuine American folklore. Her two previous books, Katrina and Panther Track, were acquired in part by the Smithsonian Institute. Her photography, published by various national and international journals around the State Department of Homeland Security, and have been featured in solo exhibitions at numerous universities and museums. I'm pleased to present the winner of this year's Donald T. Wright Award from Vicksburg, Mississippi, Melody Golding.
Thank you. Well, thank you. Thank you so much. Just makes me nervous. First of all, I wasn't planning on saying this, but I am going to say this because we're here. And the first time I really fell in love with books, I was 7 years old and I lived in a small town. And I couldn't believe that I got a library card. And I could go to the library and get books and I could put them in the basket of my bicycle. And so when I come in here and I'm around these books, I just am so happy. This is a happy place for me. I really would like to thank you all for having me here today. First, I want to tell you that my husband Steve is not here because he just got out of the hospital on Monday. And he wanted to be here and he's so disappointed that he couldn't be here. And I am just so grateful that he's better. I'm really grateful also that my son Austin is here with me. He's my backbone and gives wonderful advice, and thank you, Austin. This is about gratitude. It really is. I'm grateful for all the pilots who trusted me and shared their stories so that we can all learn and know about life between the levees. I'm also grateful that God gave me the ability to do this project. I'm grateful for being able to work with Sarah and Brittany and Nelson to prepare for this day. It's been a work in progress. I'm also, as you all know, extremely grateful to the St. Louis Mercantile Library for honoring me with the Captain Donald T. Wright Award. I was thrilled to find out that Captain Donald T. Wright was a riverboat captain, and that he was also the editor and publisher of the Waterways Journal from 1922 to 1965. Of course, this time period saw a lot of change within the river industry, the inland marine industry. But we all know that Ray Spencer Jr. and his son Nelson Spencer have carried the torch in documenting river life in the Waterways Journal. These men are also the real heroes in telling, documenting, and preserving what we know of as life on the river for the past 130 years. So thank you again for this momentous honor. I am so very humbled and grateful. Some of you may know that I come from a river family. My husband Steve has been in the river industry since 1966. Our first date was a blind date, and when he brought me in that morning at 2 a.m. after our first blind date, he said, "How would you like to make a trip on the river tomorrow?" And I said, "Yeah, I'd love to go. Never been on the river." And he said, "Okay, I'll pick you up at 7." I said, "Okay, I'll be ready." And so we got our second date. It was a trip down the Mississippi River from Pittsburgh to Natchez on the old motor vessel Martha May with Captain L.C. Williams. On the boat, one of the crew members' name was Wild Charlie, and he was a wild Indian. I am not kidding. He was a wild Indian. Back in those days, in 1979, he had on the cutoff shorts, the white beater t-shirt. He had long hair and a bandana around his head. And I've always been little all my life. One of the disadvantages of being little is sometimes people think they can pick you up. So Wild Charlie picked me up. He grabbed me by the forearms and swung me around the end of the barge, around and around and around. And he thought that that was just so great. And he was, yeah, his Indian call the whole time. And so I was just 20 years old. I thought it was awesome. Man, it's river life is fun.
Skip a lot. But when we got to Natchez, climbed off the boat, we got in a skiff, and we headed to the notorious Natchez Under the Hill. Fell in love with my husband that day, and I also fell in love with the river. My destiny was sealed that day, a destiny that has included the blessings of 2 sons, Austin and John Reed, grandson Whit, and daughter-in-law Kirsten, countless friendships, some are here. Thank you for coming. Yes, indeed. And 2 barge companies. Steve has been a licensed pilot, and we've gone from Old Man River Towing to present day Golden Barge Line, our family-owned business located in Vicksburg, Mississippi, where Austin is the president and CEO of GBL. Austin, would you please stand up? Because I'm so proud of him. I want to go back to Steve for a minute, though. This book would not have been possible without Steve's in-house lifetime river knowledge and expertise. So thank you, Steve. Without his expertise, unending support, and encouragement, it never would have been written. Whenever someone told me something about the river that I didn't quite understand or I didn't know where I was, all I had to do was go in the other room and say, Steve, what does this mean? Steve, where is this? And he knew, he's just a walking encyclopedia. So it never would have happened without him. But because of our relationship in the river industry, I was able to conduct interviews and climb on and off of vessels, and pilots trusted me with their stories. They knew that I had skin in the game. I remember I asked one pilot, I said, would you please give me your story that I'm writing a book and I would love to add you to the collection? And he said, oh, no, I can't give you a story. And I said, well, why not? He said, because he said, the last time I gave a story, they made me sound stupid. And he said, I didn't like that, and I don't want to do that again. And I told him, I said, you know, if I need brain surgery, I get a brain surgeon. But I sure don't want a brain surgeon steering my boat. I don't. I want a towboat captain, a ship captain, any kind of boat captain, but I don't want a brain surgeon doing it. Education is a relative thing. Not all people are cut out to go to college, and some can't afford to go to college, but the river offers a different kind of education. But it's an education that must be earned and not bought. I'm going to start with a few facts about what this book is about. Nelson had told you that this is my 3rd book published by the University Press of Mississippi. After my first 2 books, the University Press asked me to write a book about the river. And I thought, oh gosh, how can I write a book about the river? The river's so vast, it's so huge. And I went home and I thought about it, and I thought, I have to write a book about pilots, because pilots are the ones who have dedicated to spending their lives on the river. I didn't interview, the tankermen or the deckhands or anybody like that, because they come and go. The pilots are the ones who dedicate their lives to the river. And of course, all of you know already that all captains are pilots, but not all pilots are captains. And that is why this book is about pilots. But this book is a chronicle of first-person reflections and folklore from pilots who dedicated their lives to the river, and about the opportunity of being a riverman or woman and the sacrifice of being away from home. Sadly, since the book was published, 20 of my pilots have passed away, but their stories will be forever preserved in this book. As Nelson said, I interviewed more than 100 pilots that have lived and worked on the river, and their stories, you think when you're going to interview someone, a group of people who do the same thing, that they're all going to be the same. They're not. They're very diverse. It's full of drama and suspense and a way of life that most people just really can't imagine. Most people don't get out on the river. They go on bridges across the river, or they'll park on the bank by the river, but most people don't get on the river. And people who work on the river may as well be working on the moon. People don't know that there is an entire culture workforce on the river. Many of my pilots come from a long family line of mariners. So when I interviewed my pilots, I had a basic list of questions that I asked them all, just to try to keep, I knew that the stories were going to be all different and unique, but just trying to keep a continuity flowing in the book. So I asked them all the same questions. But I always ask them, do you come from a long line of mariners in your family? Some said yes, some said no. But Captain Randy Scarborough is a very good example. When I asked him if there was a history of mariners in his family, he said yes. My family owned the Mayflower. Did y'all hear that? My family owned the Mayflower Scarborough line. So you can look it up. It's probably in this museum somewhere. But the pilots are not just from towboats. They're from towboats, passenger steamboats, tugs, and ships, because I wanted a broad diversity of voices. This book is about life on the brown water, our inland waterways, which consist of thousands of navigable miles and touches 38 states. This book is about all of the western rivers and the Intracoastal Canal, not just the Mississippi River. So I told my publisher, I can't just write a book about the Mississippi River, because it's more than just the Mississippi River. If anything can be more than the Mississippi River, it's all of the rivers. It's all of the rivers. And so when I interviewed all of my pilots, I started out by asking them, what rivers have you been on? Well, they've listed all of them. You know, they would just go all the way down. And I finally said, well, I can't list all of these in the book because my publisher is very concerned about word count. And so just know that most of these pilots have been everywhere. They've been on all of the rivers. These are an example of the photographs in the book. The book has 130 color photographs, which I took, which visually show or a present day river life, but not life in the past. I've donated all the royalties from the sale of the book to the Siemens Church Institute, which is a nonprofit agency that was founded in 1834 and is affiliated with the Episcopal Church. It serves mariners through pastoral care and education. The river has been good to us, and I wanted to give back. Within this book are real river legends. Some have even won awards for being river legends. So, what I'm going to do now is read you some of the excerpts from the stories, and you'll recognize some of these names. Captain Clark Doc Hawley, passenger boats. These are in his words. Now, what I did when I got on and off these boats and in and out of the interviews, I had my recorder and my camera and everything with me. And so there's stories that are recorded word for word. And then I went back and transcribed it. And so what you're hearing is what they said word for word. But Captain Clark Doc Hawley, passenger boats. He said the Mississippi Queen, the Delta Queen, and the American Queen are the boats he was on. I remember Captain Eddington, who was an Ohio river pilot. He was on the boats and ran Cincinnati. He got licensed in the 1880s. Here I was working with this man who had gotten his pilot license in 1880, and I'm working with him in 1950. He worked until he was 94. He worked until 1960, and he died in 1961. And unfortunately, Dr. Hawley just passed away, I think. And so I'm so glad that I was able to get his story. In the book, stories are presented in chronological order according to the year of the pilot's birth. And the stories are from the 1920s to today. So for me, of course, I still go back and I look in the table of contents and look at the date that they were born. And I'm older than a lot of the pilots in the book. Well, I'm not younger than a lot of the pilots too, so I'm kind of a bit. But as you know, the waterways and ports in the Mississippi corridor with billions of dollars of products throughout the United States. But in today's world, those who live and work on land have little knowledge of the river and the people who work there. So having these stories, people can tell truly about life on the river firsthand. Pilots reflect on the time away from home, which is a universal reality for all mariners. I hate her when I'm with her, and I miss her when I'm gone. I traveled all over America to get my interviews, but you have to remember that this was before COVID, before life of Zoom, and so I had to go in person to interview my pilots. It took me 10 years to collect, photograph, and write this book. But in our interviews, we would laugh and we would cry, and I learned to bring a big box of tissues with me. But I went to Paducah, Memphis, New Orleans, Wood River, Houston, Baton Rouge, and somewhere south of Baton Rouge when I went to see the bananas. One time, I saw one of the passenger boats down at the city front in Vicksburg. And I thought, I want to get that captain's interview. And so I got our port captain to call their captain and say, can she come aboard and interview you for a book that she's writing? And he said, yes, come on. So I had I had my backpack, my cameras, my tripod, my life jacket, my quick card. I had everything with me. And I went on board. These little group of ladies were sitting there. I think it wasn't the American Queen. I can't remember which boat it was. But anyway, all the little ladies were sitting around having afternoon tea or cocktails. And they said, well, are you here to do something? And I said, well, I'm here to talk to the captain. You know where he is. And they said, oh, he's right there. And I said, where? And they said, oh, he's right there, right there. And I looked, and this guy was so cute. He was the cutest thing you ever saw. He was not anything you would ever imagine a boat captain to be. He's 2 years younger than Austin. And I got to get his interview. He used to pilot the boats that his dad had in Maine, the lobster boats. And so you can see that there's a broad diversity of voices in this book. The next story that I want to read to you is Terry Smiley. She says, in 1984, I went to apply as a cook on a towboat, and they said they don't hire cooks as young as me. They had to be old, fat, ugly, one foot on a banana peel and the other in a bucket. September 7th, 2000, I hit the deck. I never went back to the galley. Captain Sunshine, I've had to make my way in a man's world. She's my size, but she had to deck first. She went from the galley to deck and went up, so I'm really proud of her. Jerry Faulkner. He says, some of the early people I worked with had a history of having been all the way back into the steamboat era and before diesel engines. Captain Stuart Riley used to bring those DPC boats down. Anybody in here know what a DPC boat is? No? You have to look it up. They were named after islands in the Pacific. Captain Stuart Riley, he was from the Ohio at mile 535. He was the steamboat captain. Peanut Hollinger. Anybody in here know Peanut Hollinger? Okay, you're gonna like this story. And thank you, Austin, for this. He says, I went to work 2 months before I was 14, and I've been doing it ever since. I knew that this was what I was going to do for a career the first time I got my check. The first check I got was $37.50, and it was the most money I had ever seen. I went uptown. I drank chocolate milkshakes until I was about to throw up. I bought a stack of funny books and a whole box of almond Hershey bars. I remember I was sitting on the head of that boat, eating those almond Hershey bars, reading those funny books, and I had money sticking out of every pocket. I knew right then that you couldn't get any closer to heaven than that. And I always had a pocket full of money. It just kept getting better and better. Can you hear him say that? That's right. Butch Harrington. He says, I'm a musician, and there are musicians on the river. There's that one magical time where a song comes along to you complete, and all you can do is sit down and just start writing, and that's what happened to me on my song River. I just remember walking across the head of the boat to the Shirley Bowen, and lyrics were just coming at me. And so I kept right on walking right into the galley. And I sat down and I wrote that song in 15 minutes. It was about the river. I hate her when I'm with her, and I miss her when I'm gone. Larry Ritchie. I come from first generation riverman George Ritchie. He was in the book by Mark Twain, Life on the Mississippi. We are 5th generation towboaters. Pretty big family, and they're all boatmen. Joy Manthey. Anyone in here know Joy Manthey? Okay. Joy says, I started working on the boats when I was 10 years old and popping popcorn on the steamer President in the 5th grade. I took a test at school. What do you want to do when you grow up? I put river pilot. My teacher made me erase it and told me that I could be a teacher or a nurse or a nut. So that's what really made me start striving to be a captain, because my 5th grade teacher told me that I couldn't do it. When I was working on the boats, and because I was a nun, the wives weren't threatened. They were okay with me working on the boat because I was a nun. Sister Joy. Because I was a nun, I guess they thought I was a refrigerator. That I just didn't have any interest in sex or whatever. I don't know what the hell they thought, but I think God used me for that. He used me as a chaplain. Some people call me Sister Mary Captain. Okay. Louis Reinhardt. I started down the river when I was 13 years old. World War II was going on and crew members were hard to come by. My first trip, the Mississippi River froze over at Vicksburg. It stayed frozen there for 14 days and nights. Every morning about 4 o'clock, I would take 5 gallons of water and put it on the butane stove in the galley and get it so hot that I could pour it around the cook's door, get her out of the room so she could cook us breakfast. Okay, you're gonna like this one. If you've been bored so far, you're gonna like this one. Mark Corey. When he came in and gave me his interview, we were in our office. We were in our conference room, and we had a wonderful interview, and he told me all about life on the river like everyone else. But at the end of the interview, we both stood up from the table, and he started to undo his pants, and he said, I have something I really want to show you. And I said, no, I don't want to see it. Whatever it is, no. He said, no, you gotta see it. You have to. And I said, no, I don't. He said, you have to see this. And he dropped his pants and he turned around and it was a big blessed be tattooed on his rear end. He said, told you I was a company man.
True story.
I never knew what I was gonna get. Okay, so I've saved the best for last. Jerry Tinkler, the real river legend. He's the only pilot in the book who's here today. So thank you so much for being our representative. He's an excellent captain, true leader, corporate CEO. He did it all. He did it all. I mean, the man is a giant in the river industry. And I thank you for giving me your story, sharing your story with me. So here's 2 excerpts from his story, and he's on page 43. Back when I first started, you had to chart every inch of the river. During the Second World War, you had to chart a mile above and a mile below the bridges. But after the war, then you had to start charting the whole thing again. All of the testing and all of examinations were based on wooden hull steamboats because there weren't any license requirements for diesel boats. There were only license requirements for steamboats. You had to learn everything from one of the old pilots that you were working with. The licensing questions were done in presumption that you were going to be working on a wooden hull steamboat. So that's pretty amazing. That's pretty amazing. That's definitely a thing of the past of the steamboat licensing. Here's the second part. I remember a story told to me about when Anheuser-Busch decided they were going to try to get in the wine business a little bit. They had a naval architect design a tank barge for them. They had a stainless steel tank. They were going to haul wine from someplace down south and bring it into their place there in St. Louis. Well, Federal Barge Line took the contract to lease the barge. They assured the captain that there was no way that the guys working on the boat could figure out how to tap the tank and get the wine out of there. But sure enough, the first trip up the river with that wine, the captain got a call and it woke him up about 2 or 3 o'clock in the morning. Said, "Captain, you better get down here. We've got a problem on the boat." Captain said, "What's the matter?" He said, "The crew is drunk." So he went in the galley and he talked to the cook and he said, "Now, what time did you get up?" She said, "Well, I get up around 4. Captain said, "Did you notice anything different, like somebody was drinking or something?" "Well," she said, "I can't say that anybody was drinking, but when I came into the galley, the mate was standing up on the table. He slammed a bottle of ketchup against the wall and said, 'Let the good times roll.'" So thank you. And thank you for this wonderful award. I'm just very humble. Thank you all.
Thank you again, Melody. It's my privilege to introduce the 2023 recipient of the James B. Swift Medal for Excellence in Maritime Literature. Dr. Greg Andrews is a distinguished history professor emeritus at Texas State University, a former National Endowment for the Humanities Fellow, and a prize-winning author of 6 books. He's also a singer-songwriter who fronts the swampy blues band Dr. G and the Mudcats. Dr. Andrews and I first corresponded by email and phone during the height of the global coronavirus pandemic. He wanted to explore our collections for a book he was writing, the book we're here to honor him for today, actually, Shanty Boats and Roustabouts, the River Poor of St. Louis. He'd come across our digital library online and had been exploring our collections we'd made available on there, but was wondering what other materials we had on the subject, which ended up being quite a lot, actually. He currently lives in Texas, so he was unable to visit us in person because of the COVID travel and safety restrictions at the time. Fortunately, the library was able to meet his needs through our distance research services. It was an honor to assist him with his work and contribute in some small way to his much needed and thoughtful examination of the river poor of the Mississippi Valley. Dr. Andrews' own grandmother came from a shanty boat family, and he himself grew up south of Hannibal in the Mississippi River bottoms. His background uniquely qualified him to uncover and share this story with the world. In his book, he explores waterfront settlements and shanty boat colonies facing pervasive harassment and forced evictions, communities not unlike the one his grandmother lived in. At the same time, he examines the lived experiences of Mississippi roustabouts so often brutalized and dehumanized by a waterways labor system that carried with it the vestiges of American slavery. In his book, Dr. Andrews systematically acknowledges and dismantles romanticized river tropes and racist river nostalgia to find the real people and real stories of courage, resiliency, perseverance, and community that coalesced around the banks of America's mightiest river. I could go on, but I'd much rather let Dr. Andrews tell you about his work himself. So please let us all give a warm round of applause to the 2023 recipient of the James B. Swift Medal, Dr. Greg Andrews.
lot.
First of all, I want to thank everyone here associated with this really impressive library for such great hospitality, and of course, above all, for honoring me with this award here. I especially want to thank Sarah Hodge, Julie Dunmorton, and Brittany West for treating us to a wonderful dinner last night at Lombardo's restaurant. And we sure did appreciate that and enjoy it. If y'all don't mind, I want to introduce some people in the crowd. As Sarah mentioned, I grew up over 100 miles north of here. And some of my family members are here today. Some of them I haven't seen for quite a while. First of all, I want to introduce my wife and fellow historian, Victoria Pine. Right? Moving on these adventures now from the river here in the Mississippi Valley to Jones County Jubilee. I mean, Jones County, Mississippi. And we've enjoyed life together, doing the history the way that we wanted to do it, you know. And my approach has always been to study history from the bottom up. You learn a lot about the world we live in and about our history by doing that. And I appreciate the remarks and congratulations here to Melody as well about what she's contributed here, you know, in the way of the pilots, the history on the Mississippi River. I also want to introduce my family, other family members here. And this Rita Mack right here, Diana Ferris, Mack, Christy Mack, Darley, and Mike Ferris. I'm really proud to share a history of this family with our shanty boat roots. We're proud of it. And we wear it, I think, wear it well. And they also live here in St. Louis, and so I appreciate them coming out. Some of my friends, I see Pigeon O'Brien. Where did she go? She was here just a minute ago. I met her through Texas Music down in San Marcos, Texas, when she was a music publicist. And she was here. She's probably still here somewhere. But Dean Klinkenberg here, I met 10 years ago. The Mississippi Valley Traveler, does wonderful work on the Mississippi River. I've learned a lot from his writings. Novelist, and a kayaker and canoeist on the Mississippi, and travel guides about the Mississippi River, especially on the upper Mississippi. And he's been it's been a real pleasure to have him as a friend. And so from high school in 1967, right here, Regina Loeblein from St. Louis. Last time I saw Regina, we were getting off a train. We'd been to Mexico and on a little high school group tour. So it's nice to get reacquainted. And some friends that I hadn't met personally yet until today, but John and Tony Hancock right here from St. Louis, and met them because of the book and also their familiarity with Vicky's works. So if I left someone out here who's here that I don't know, but I sure appreciate those of you that bothered to come out, you know, today for this. This is the first time, I believe, in 9 years. Vicki and I have been to St. Louis, and it was naturally the Cardinals game. We were here in 2011 for the playoff game, one of the playoff games against the Phillies. That was a big year in 2011. And we caught one of those playoff games. Without Sarah's research help and guidance, and this library's vast waterways holdings, I don't think I could have written this book. I didn't plan to write one anyway. I've been retired, whatever that means, for about since 2009. But I've been active, you know, and I've written some other books in the meantime. So I don't have to go to committee meetings anymore. That's the wonderful part about being retired from university. Those of you with academia know what I'm talking about. But I thought I would choose today as a theme for my remarks, the Mississippi River Highway of the Poor. And, you know, the river has been a lifelong friend of mine. And it's also been a major cultural influence on me as a historian and as a person and as a singer-songwriter. I grew up in Monkey Run, Missouri. The village at the time had about 100 people. And it's about 3 miles south of Hannah in the river bottom there, right along the railroad tracks. You know, the tracks in the river, you can't separate them. And that's where I grew up. It's in the northeast corner of Rawls County. If you've been to the Mark Twain Cave and saw a big cement plant just south of the cave, that village is still there today, mostly. I don't think there's quite 100 people there anymore, but probably as many dogs anyway, as we had back then. It was you know, the village consisted of modest homes. Some might call them river shacks, but we didn't. They were our homes. And this was once a section of a company town, cement company owned town called Alaska. And if you take the tour if you drive up the Great River Road and go into Hannibal, coming from St. Louis, you'll drive right by what used to be Alaska. There's a great monument there that the people themselves financed, former people who lived there. And we were kicked out of there. Our schools were demolished, churches were demolished. And so to make way for that highway and for the U.S. Steel Corporation to build a new plant there, expanded their plant and operations. And so I'm a small town boy. I went to school in Hannibal after they made us get rid of the schools in Alaska. It was mainly a town dominated primarily by Southern and Eastern European immigrants. In 1903 is when the town was formed, and it was destroyed in the early 1960s. Monkey Run, the section we know as Monkey Run, was populated by a lot of fishermen, commercial fishermen. I rode in a lot of cars as a kid with cars that smelled like fish from all those tubs, you know, of fish that they carried around in the trunk and in the back of their vehicles. And my father, who was a cement plant worker, and my mother was a shoe factory worker. So that's where I'm coming from, how I approach this, you know, and the river was my playground as a child. It was a place to fish. It was a place to sneak a cigarette for a kid, swim, sip a little moonshine, hurriedly. But my mom didn't care for that kind of stuff, you know. And she didn't know, fortunately, a lot of the things that I did down by the river. Best left that alone anyway. But it was also a place to try to get away from the blues and the hard struggles of not just my family, but other family members who had those struggles. My father was disabled, died when I was 15 from occupational disease, lung-related problems. And so we had a hard struggle. My mom did her best and, you know, raised 3 children. And she was always proud and probably in some occasions, proud as she should have been. But, you know, we built a tree house when I was a kid up in the cottonwoods that lined Wood River. You know, and just a beautiful place to have a great outlook on the river. I remember as a child going into town, and I'm not sure whether we sneaked onto that riverboat or what, but about 3 friends, I was about 10 years old. We went on an excursion boat one night. It was great. And I've been trying to play music ever since I heard that dance band that night on the boat, you know. And there was a huge thunderstorm came up while we were on the boat. I remember that too. But I developed a healthy respect for the river as well as a love for it. One of my earliest memories, as far as I can tell, it's a fragmented one, but was being rushed in my frantic mother's arms as a toddler, 2.5. Down a dirt alley and up the railroad tracks to where the Marble Creek empties into the Mississippi. And my dad was down there fishing at the mouth of the river. And I could still feel that my mother's pulse racing. For all she knew, it might have been my father. Someone had drowned at the mouth of the river, just where my father was fishing. And so that, I have that as my first memory in life. It involved the river. So I've always had a deep sense of attachment to place. It's still home. And even though I've lived my career in Texas, I mean, coming here today, it feels like I've come home because the river is not too far from here, And I know when I started playing Texas music, I was kind of a weirdo because, I'm playing all this stuff about the Mississippi River. I'm writing these songs about the Mississippi River, and so they didn't know quite what to do with me. How do you fit into Texas country and all that kind of stuff? And I didn't let that stop me. I just kept writing about the river. And I think for those, if you ever attend a show by Dr. Gene Mudcatcher, or if you ever have, the river is in nearly every song. It's one of the great props that I found for my music. I choose that title today for my thought because I took it from a writing by, in 1914, W.A. Curtis was a writer. He was on his way to St. Paul from St. Louis on the Streckwas steamer, the City. And he made these observations. Of course, the river was a much busier place in the 1800s than it is now. And he looked out, and I want to make sure I get his quote right. This is what he said, what he wrote. Rafts with families on them floated by us. On island after island, queer-looking sloops were hauled up among the trees, and people camped beside them. How sailing vessels manage with a changing channel, I could not imagine. End quote. He was referring to shanty boat people. William Dean Howells, earlier, an American writer and of course a friend of Mark Twain's. He described the line of shanty boats that he saw from the deck of an Ohio River stern wheeler. This is what he said. The houses had in common the form of a freight car set in a flat-bottomed boat. The car would be shorter or longer, with 1 or 2 or 3 windows in its sides, and a section of stovepipe softly smoking from its roof. The windows might be curtained, or they might be bare. But apparently there was no other distinction among the houseboat dwellers whose sluggish craft lay moored among the willows, or tied to an elm or a maple, or even made fast to a stake on shore. The boats described by Curtis and Howells provided iconic images of a waterways culture that flourished in the age of Mark Twain and far beyond. Picturesque flotillas of shanty boats adorned the cultural landscape of American rivers in the late 19th century. Chicken coops, cages of pet pigeons, often rode on top of the boat's roofs, with trammel nets stretched across the top of the drive. Kids and cats and coon dogs scurried about on the sides of the boats. And amid, ropes and barrels and whatever else they had out there on the sides. And with just a low railing to keep them in. And, chickens, they had you could train goats and chickens to learn to walk a game plan. And so they knew, you learn pretty quickly if you're a chicken or a goat, where you go and where you don't go. And a few of the larger boats, might have aboard a cow or a goat or a tame duck or maybe a hog or a pet coon or, something like that. It was a common sight. The rest relied primarily on oars and poles for the steering. And they usually had an attached skip, of some kind. More likely than not, a rifle or a double barrel shotgun and an American flag hung on the interior of the shanty boat. Plenty of ammunition aboard, plenty of tobacco, plenty of squirrel whiskey also, or some other kind, but squirrel whiskey was among them. Of course, the size and decor of these houseboats depended on the income of their owners. And you can find some quite lavish boats on the river as well. A houseboat, let's say built of odds and ends of driftwood or pine boards and runaway logs that were plucked out of the river, they cost about $20 at the time. More pretentious boats might cost a few $100s or more. But a more typical boat was about 6 or 7 feet high, 10 feet long, and about 8 feet wide, looking much like a freight car. It usually had a couple of doors and walls covered with batten tar paper. Maybe windows covered with some kind of mosquito netting, hopefully. Or some kind of oilcloth or a tarp, to keep out the rain. In 1901, a resident of one of the shanty boat settlements here in St. Louis, Little Oklahoma, it's called. He was very enterprising. He found an old discarded streetcar here in St. Louis, and he fixed it up, put floats under it, and he was going to take his family and float south to New Orleans in the fall. So if you couldn't afford the transportation and take a nice vacation in New Orleans, you do this stuff. I've often wondered if he ever set float. I mean, if he ever set sail and how far he made it, his wife might have refused to go with him. I don't know. But the humblest version, I think, of a shanty boat looked more like a raft, the doghouse on it. And that's the kind that Mark Twain used to send Huck and Jim on the trip down the river. That's what he was talking about. That's one of the in fact, that picture that you have here, that very much resembles that. The waterways culture included 3 generations of my grandmother's family. They were day laborers and fishermen and washerwomen, as were so many, who lived on the river at that time. In 1901, they were among the people kicked off the Hannibal's South Levee at the foot of Jefferson Street. When the Burlington Northern Railroad agents came in and local vigilantes, and they took axes and steel bars and smashed their homes if they didn't leave. And of course, some of them couldn't. Their boats, they'd been there a long time and they weren't seaworthy. They didn't have the money to fix them. So, but they came in and destroyed the homes and the boats and scattered their belongings along the shoreline and taunted them and jeered at them at the same time. You read what happened here in St. Louis in 1895. It's in my book. What happened to one section of Little Oklahoma, where the police come in with waterfront gangs, and they use the waterfront gangs. Most of these were women at the time, had no place to live, and they sent these waterfront gangs in there to get them out because of development projects going on. So it's like I said, you'll find many examples of this in my book. By the way, 6 years earlier, in 1894, about 95 actually, my grandmother next to them there on the levee, Cliff Edwards. I mean, you all know who Cliff Edwards was. He was the I don't want to take anything for granted today, but he was Walt Disney's voice of Jiminy Cricket. And Edwards was a vaudeville singer and an actor, Hollywood actor. And he was born there, and this is what he had to say about it. Later on, of course, they lived here on the riverfront in St. Louis. He said, the boat was tied to a clump of willows below the levee at Hannibal, And we were so poor that father paid the doctor who attended mother by giving him a mess of carved buffalo. End quote. In early 2020, when COVID imposed isolation on us and shut down all the music venues where my band and I played, I need to do something with my time. And so I turned to trying to, and I had this in mind for a while, but I wanted to frame my ancestors' river heritage in a broader cultural context. And I realized they fit in. Where do they fit in? Well, they weren't an anomaly on that Henry levee. And so that's when I began this project. And like I said, Sarah, I don't know, I was fortunate to have made contact with her through email. And I was just going to write an article first. But I decided to use the St. Louis levee because it made sense. St. Louis was, a booming city at the time, at the turn of the 20th century. And its location, with the Mississippi and the Missouri and, the Illinois rivers, this was a place to be. It was a very vibrant place in the steamboat era. And so I decided to use St. Louis as the basis of or the primary place to focus my energies. But I wanted to take a look at the whole Mississippi Valley. Now that's a lot to do in one book. So I was fortunate. I think I had maybe 160,000 words, and LSU pressed on me. I could only have 120. Now they were generous. They let me put 20 photos, or I had all kinds of photos from the library here, besides the ones I had. So I had to narrow it somewhat, and I decided to look at the period from 1875 through the Great Depression, with an epilogue that looks at what happens here on the St. Louis levee in the 1930s as a way to conclude the book. The city's waterfront here, of course, was home to all kinds of shantyboat communities, and I had to narrow them down a bit because there were so many of them. But over time, certain identities stood out with these communities, and so I was able to look at places like Little Oklahoma on the North Ward, which was the largest shantyboat settlement here in St. Louis, near the McKinley Bridge. It's around where Mount Rock Street is, and going south to about Dock Street. There was a well-defined settlement there. There was a Dock Street addition to Little Oklahoma. It was still a part of it. And it had several hundred people who lived there. And places like that, and also like Squatterstown to the south, on the south side, and Chickentown, even a little further south, down Carondelet. They emerged with their own identities. And so did Sandy Hook across the river in East St. Louis. So those were the places that I primarily focused. And when industrialization swept St. Louis and the United States in the late 1800s, these settlements swelled. There was a series of economic depressions, I think, that were responsible for driving a lot of poor people to the river. It was the only safety net they had at the time. The river really was a safety. They could at least put up a lean-to or build a shanty boat or buy one fairly cheap, because there were a lot of boat builders on the levee who made it for those purposes. And according to one estimate I read, about 3,000 shanty boat wayfarers from the chain of rocks to the Merrimack, or down to or the Arson, but several thousand here at least. I found it interesting, a great quote here. I want to use Nate Skoll, who was a boat builder here on the levee. He expressed, I think, a sentiment that was widely shared by a lot of his fellow residents of Little Oklahoma. He said, "You can't get me to move from here. I like to be by the river, and I'm always happy when I'm here." I go to sleep in my little flatboat on the water and feel as safe as any millionaire in his palace. And a good deal safer when the storm blows up. St. Louis, of course, was also a major headquarters for roustabouts. Crews of roustabouts, the lowliest laborers on the steamboats. They did the loading and unloading at the landings between the terminals. Let's say St. Louis to New Orleans, one of the anchor lines, for example. They did all the loading, and anything else that needed to be done. And they dealt with contrary razorback hogs, trying to load hogs and load cattle. And you get in some of those spots where the mosquitoes, heavy infestations of mosquitoes, or storming and the banks caving in, and they had no real grading to the landing, and in the south that was especially true. So it was dangerous work. And so they were an indispensable pool of cheap labor. Many of them were enslaved before the war. So they were continuing the same kind of work, although now as freedmen. But as Sarah indicated in her introduction to my talk, they were well, I lost my train of thought there for a second. Let me keep going. They were I guess you could say they formed the mudsill of a waterway system that really brutalized them as human beings. They put up with routine insults, racial insults and epithets, and beatings on the job. Either with canes loaded with lead, something to pack a little more water, that kind of stuff. And you can imagine, there's a lot of violence on the steamboats. I don't know anybody probably at that time who worked on the steamboats that wasn't armed some kind. And the roustabouts gave us, they give back too. There were a lot of shooting, there were a lot of fights, and particularly with the mates. And sometimes, if you had a captain like to mix it up, and he might come in and get involved himself. So that was the nature of the work. And I thought I'd give you a quote here from a roustabout, George Arnold, who in a 1936 WPA interview looked back on his life as a roustabout. And he was born enslaved in Tennessee in 1861. And this is what he had to say. The life of a roustabout is the life of a dog. I do not recall any unkindness of slavery days. I was too young to realize what it was all about then. But it never could have equaled the cruelty shown the laborer on the riverboats by cruel mates and overseers. End of quote. The literary figure, of course, of the black roustabout is probably the most enduring cultural symbol of the levee, from minstrel shows and vaudeville, magazines, newspapers, other writings. What white American audiences at the time couldn't get enough of the sentimentalized steamboat character. But I wasn't so much interested in that literary image. I wanted to get down, put flesh on the bones. And look at things like wages, working conditions, bargaining tactics. How did roustabouts try to improve their life? And they did. What were their strategies, tactics? I also wanted a deeper look at their life in the entertainment district here. Especially their role in shaping ragtime music, blues, and riverboat jazz, because they were instrumental in that development. You could feel the beat in the hustle and bustle of the levee. You could in the raucous, rowdy saloons along the St. Louis levee, and the rivers, the river's tumultuous cycles. Dangerous river can be a beautiful thing. It can be a dangerous place for all people who work on the river, captains alike. So it can turn on pretty quickly. And according to popular images, I think at the time, rouseabouts were either ridiculed and feared as river riffraff. A lot of them were ended up in the workhouse here in St. Louis because they fall asleep in the pool hall somewhere. And if you had both eyes closed, you were a vagrant. And so that meant, here's your fine. Well, they knew you couldn't pay the fine, so off you go to the workhouse to work on the chain gang at the quarry. It was that kind of system. And I talk about this a lot. W.C. Handy, father of the blues, he spent some time in St. Louis on the levee in 1892, and he had some fascinating things to say about his experience. In most cases, the shanty boaters were different groups, racially and culturally, but they shared a class-based levee culture in more ways, I think, than often thought. Newspapers and critics of the River Corps often complained about miscegenation and the interracial composition of waterfront settlements. Newspaper editors wrote about it, complained about it. For sure, inhabitants of the levee colonies were blasted as shipwrecked ne'er-do-wells, prone to thieving and all kinds of sordid crimes. But the river was far more complex than that. This is what a Paducah farmer had to say. He lived close to the levee. He met a lot of shanty boat people in his life. And he told travel writer and photographer Clifton Johnson, I've been acquainted with a heap of it. And 90% of them are as honest and good-hearted as you could ask. It'd surprise you what fine and intelligent people there are among them. For pilots, of course, shanty boat river traffic was nothing but a nuisance. Mark Twain had something to say about that in Life on the Mississippi. This is a quote from him. Pilots bore a mortal hatred for this craft, and it was returned with usury. Pilots often tried to bully shanty boat people off the river. There were plenty of examples of that. They complained that shanty boat people created nighttime hazards because they didn't have lights on their boats, and they were drunk and asleep. And by law, shanty boats were they were required to display some kind of light, but sometimes they didn't. And Twain recalled an incident from his days on the river when they almost rammed the shanty boat behind an island, very, very dark. And they just at the last minute, they heard the sounds of music coming up from the shanty boat. And the pilot took evasive action just in time to keep shearing them off. And Twain said, these people brought their lantern then, of course, and as we backed and filled to get away, precious family stood in the light of it, both sexes and various ages, and cursed us till everything turned blue. On a chilly day, late October day here in St. Louis in 1895, a St. Louis Post-Dispatch reporter and a staff artist climbed aboard a yacht owned by William Zink, who was commissioned to take them on a story assignment about the annual fall migration of shanty boat wayfarers south. Then they would come back in the spring, and that was the pattern. And usually the newspaper, especially the Post-Dispatch, would send reporters out to do this in the fall. And near the chain of rocks, the crew found Jack Berry and his 4 small children on their way home, on their way south from all the way to St. Paul in one of the humblest boats on the river. The reporter described the family's cobbled together home as a quote, collection of old rags patched together and stretched over a limb of a tree which formed a pole in the shape of a figured T. While Barry stood in awe of this yacht that pulls up, the reporter stared in bewilderment at the shanty boat. Ain't you afraid a wind will sweep you away? The reporter asked. Not a bit of danger, Barry said. We got the rags tied down good and hard. Ain't no show of this outfit going under. You can't sink it. On the previous fall migration south, Barry lost his wife after a collision with a ferry boat just north of Cable. The ferry operator plucked the family out of the water. It's a wonder they didn't all drown at the time. And he dropped them off at the river's edge, all soaking wet, without any kind of matches or any way to get warm, stay warm. This is the fall. Here's what Barry said: the best we could do was to jump out of the wet rags or wring them as dry as we could and let the wind do the rest. So right after that, his wife died. He said she just kicked up and got sick, and then she died. We buried her right there and stayed around for 3 weeks trying to fix a new squad, new shanty boat. All of us were mighty nigh dead when we got down to the warm country. Now me and the children are all alone. Maggie, she's 7. She does the cooking. The others help fish, and we manage to get along. I think that was a very typical his story. You know, I like that voice coming from him. I think it reflected away a lot of the hard life that they had, but they loved the river, and it was a way for them to live and live in a way that they wanted to. The waterfront in St. Louis, of course, the largest city on the Mississippi at the time, provided it for me as I did this study. It gave me a panoramic view into the world of the poor, river poor in the Mississippi Valley. At the time, of course, the city here is transforming from a steamboat town to an industrial city. And this created problems for everybody in a sense, but for city officials especially, they didn't know what to do with these people that were congregating on the waterfronts. Now we know what they did in the 30s. They got them out of there. But the world that opened up to me as I began to research the book was a wonderful, colorful world of colorful cast of characters. Shell diggers, swamp healers, steamboat missionaries. They were all on the river. Steamboat pilots, stevedores, showboat and circus entertainers, pirates, pearl hunters, and preachers, all in their boats. Photographers, patent medicine peddlers, fiddlers and fortune tellers, and fishermen, artists, actors, and deckhands, and blues and jazz musicians, of course. The waterways were filled with roustabouts, merchants, day laborers, itinerant skilled workers, gamblers, an occasional bohemian, and hucksters of about every stripe. Patent medicine mainly. But I think by releasing, to go back to Sarah's introduction, by releasing the roustabouts and river rats from these class-based and racist caricatures of them. Because if you read newspaper reports at the time, mostly they poke fun at it. But you know what? On the other hand, they envy too. They didn't pay taxes. Didn't have to bother with that. They lived the way they wanted to. They saw that sometimes the reporters, they were very admiring of some of the critics. But then on the other hand, they were ridiculed and trashing. I think, the way they were treated in dime novels and magazines and early Hollywood at the time, it's very negative images. But I think by releasing them from these caricatures, we give dignity to their daily struggle. And it takes us closer to understanding their life and what their dreams were, really. Many of them wanted to be steamboat pilots. Mark Twain talked about that. That was for every boy, especially at that time. That was a big dream, and I mentioned earlier that the roustabouts, they protested, they fought back. They went to the maritime courts and sued, and went to local sheriffs, oftentimes with very little results. But when the brutality got so bad, they really felt like, law ought to get involved. And they even attempted to create a union in the river strike of 1892. Which, and again, you can read, I cover that quite a bit in my book, against the anchor line steamboats between St. Louis and New Orleans. Shanty boat squatters also are often invoking riparian rights and homesteading laws. They saw the river, as long as there was not an improved levee, wherever there was not an improved levee, they had a right to that land. They had a right to settle there. And some of them, you know, they were permanent homes for 15 years, or sometimes 20. They improved their gardens and flowers and all that, and developed informal kinds of governance to help keep order in the community. And the authorities were frustrated by repeat. You couldn't get rid of them. That's what they complained about. You run them away from this part of the river, they go across the river or come downstream with a waste to set up there. And so for municipal authorities here in St. Louis, it posed a problem because it was clashing with the developers' interest in the levee. And that was the primary clash, I think, that took place at the time. But I'd like to read a couple of quotes here in conclusion. Annie Warren was a longtime resident of the Sandy Hook settlement across the river in East St. Louis. And her family in 1905 faced eviction by the Wiggins Ferry Company, which by that time was a subsidiary of the Terminal Railroad Association. And they were notified, they were served sheriff notices in 1905 after they lived there for over 15 years. Had gardens, had made improvements in their, some of them built chicken houses on this little island, where they stayed. And so they were facing eviction notices. And Annie Warren, when a newspaper reporter, Post-Dispatch, went over to talk to her about it, she said, well, this is the quote, well, as long as I have a shotgun and a 38 caliber revolver around, you can say for me that the Warrens will be living right here on Sandy Hook, sheriff or no sheriff. Land along the river where there is no improved levee is mine, I take. The river is our native country. We live on the river. We're not going to leave. She left. There was a force, sheriff deputies, and Wiggins Ferry guards that sent and knocked them up, knocked all the sheds down, the homes, and everything. So, but her words really spoke to me, I think, in a deep way. You know, they got, for people along the levees, they got fish for their food, water for their coffee, as strange as that may sound to us today, and driftwood for fuel. In conclusion, I'd like to leave you with one other, the words of one other person here. Clarence Jones, a young St. Louis trader who took up life on the Mississippi River houseboat after his sweetheart left. He gave these observations to a Chicago news reporter. I've been on the river 3 years. The first year you don't like it very well, but you think it's easy. The second year you have your doubts about how much the river can do to you if you try. The third year you're in love with it, but you ain't got no doubt. You're afraid of the river every minute, sleeping or awake. Thank you very much.
Thank you again, Greg. Thank you all for joining us today. Now, if you'd like, we have refreshments and hors d'oeuvres in the atrium for a nice little social hour where you can speak to our award recipients and ask them questions about their book. And I know that Melody also brought some order forms if you'd like to purchase one of her books. And Greg brought a few copies of his for sale and can also explain where you can purchase them. So thank you all again, and then make your way to the atrium.